volumes, called Mythologique, the Science of Mythology. And the final chapter of the final volume was called The Naked Man. So you had the raw and the cooked, from honey to ashes, the origin of table manners, the naked man. The final chapter was called One Myth Only. And what Lévi-Strauss discovered, which is just sort of beautiful, amazing, moving, powerful, is that the entire planet is covered with a web of ancient mythology. Some of the stories are relatively recent in the sense that they've undergone changes, but what Lévi-Strauss showed was that all the world's myths are variations on a theme. It's almost as if you have one myth, but that doesn't make it boring. All the myths are magnificently, beautifully different from each other. And the point I made last week, it's a little bit like saying, is it boring that all the world's forms of life, all the trees, all the bananas, all the fruit flies, the humans, the giraffes, the whales, is it boring to say they're really all the same because they consist of the 4 letters of the genetic alphabet, C, G, T, A, which of course is genetic code. And in combination, that genetic code makes this huge variety. And what Lévi-Strauss was saying is that it's not boring that all the myths are the same. It's quite different. It's understanding precisely how different they are with respect to each other. So there are variations on a theme in the sense that there's an ultimate deep grammar of mythology, if you like, a syntax, a sort of, you can change all sorts of things, and you can certainly change the moral message of the stories, what it sort of means. But what you can't really change is the underlying grammar. Right, last week we did the Little Briar Rose. So I kind of would like to know, perhaps I won't ask all of you on Zoom. I think your Zoom are very regular people on Zoom. The people who can't make it through the snow or weather, whatever it is, to hear a little bit more varied. How many people were here last week? Put your hands up, please. Oh dear. Well, it's very good that you were here last week, but it's obviously
hands as well.
Obviously less than half of you. Okay, so I'll just say very briefly, I think. We found the story of the Sleeping Beauty to be a version of this fundamental idea, and I'll just describe it. These myths start with this world. What do I mean by this world? It's the world where you can see people, you move around, you've got a body, you eat, you sleep, you have sex, you have children, you do sort of normal things. So you start off in this world. And then what happens is that there's an event, quite often a flow of blood, or maybe something symbolic of blood. And what that does, it takes you into the other world. What do I mean by the other world? It's where you go to when you die. So you're alive, and then you're dead. And there's nothing magic about being dead. I mean, all of us, we're alive and then we're dead. So that's not magic. But all these stories are magical. And the magic thing is this: having gone from life to death, you come back from the dead. And that is real magic. You can say it's the kind of oldest magic trick in the whole history of humanity. It's kind of interesting that the Bushmen, people of the Kalahari, when they heard about Jesus, who died and came alive again, they said, that is a very clever trick. Because of that, of course, their God is not a boring, static man up in heaven somewhere. Their God is, or gods are tricksters. And the trickster's main trick is to go from life to death and back again, but also from male to female and back again, from human to animal and back again. So they have this thing called the trickster as their deity, and the trickster's funny. So the trickster's a figure of fun. You party with the trickster, you laugh with the trickster, and that's their religion, is all about humor and laughter. Very different, of course, from all the world's patriarchal religions, which are rather solemn and miserable and probably too serious. You don't laugh with God, really, I don't think.
Certainly don't laugh at him.
You certainly don't laugh at him, thank you. You don't laugh at God, whereas the trickster, you're supposed to laugh at him as well as with him. So what's that got to do with the Sleeping Beauty? Obviously, I'm not going to go through the whole story all over again, but I think you can immediately see that the story of the Sleeping Beauty is about king and queen yearning for a child. You can't have one. For some reason, the king isn't getting his wife pregnant. What happens is that the queen is in the garden, next to a pool of water. She's crying her eyes out because she wants a baby. Out pops a frog, very wet, big frog, lands in her lap, and the job's done. So 9 months later, she has a baby. It's a little girl. They have a christening, naming ceremony. In the tradition, there was 13 wise women you have to invite to the ceremony to give her all the blessings. The king says, no, I've only got 12 golden plates, which tells you really that the 13 wise women would have had different kind of plates. And you think about it, and the 13 of them is really telling you what are there 13s, like opposite to the sun in a calendar, clearly 13 silver plates, 13 moons. There's 13 moons, full or new, in any solar year. The king seems to disagree with wise women, certainly when there's 13 of them, certainly with silver plates, got something against the moon, if you like. He's in favor of a solar calendar, 12 solar months, man-made months in a year. And the whole story is about who governs time. Was it 13 wise women through the moon? Or is it somebody who's coming with a newfangled idea, probably a Christian, who says, no, we want man-made months, and there are 12 of them, and the 12 suns signify that. And then what happens is that the fairies arrive to give their blessings. The 13th is left out. Her blessing she's the most powerful of the fairy. Her blessing would have been the final blessing that can be given to a young girl, which is the blessing of fertility. That blessing is rejected. The 13th fairy is very angry about this. And because her blessing is rejected by the patriarchy, by the king, by this new system of solar timekeeping, the blessing is turned into its opposite. What's the opposite of a blessing? Curse. And this is the curse, telling you that the blessing of menstruation has been turned into not just a curse, but the curse. Okay? So, the curse is that the girl will come of age, bleed, die forever. The 12th fairy isn't powerful enough to lift that curse, but she can commute the death sentence to a death of only 100 years. And that 100 years is like a very long seclusion. Normally, a girl would go into seclusion, kind of temporary death, maybe with her sisters and brothers for a short period. But because the king has refused to let any menstrual blessing occur or any period of seclusion occur, the 13th fairy is pronounced that she will die forever. The 12th commutes it to she will have a very long period of seclusion, 100 years. Everyone's not happy about that, but it doesn't matter. It happens anyway. She comes of age, she pricks her finger, she's dead for 100 years. And I'll stop now and simply say that the message of that story is you men, you think you can control time with your newfangled solar calendars. We'll teach you a thing or two about time. We women, we'll lock you in time for 100 years, and when we see fit, we'll let you out. I mean, you can debate the story. There are other interpretations, not very many other interpretations. The only one I've heard of really is the following. This story means that if you're a boy and you want to get anywhere in life, you need to take out your sword and kill monsters and be active in the world to get your bride. But if you're a girl, what you have to do is very different. You've got to lie on your back for 100 years and wait for this hero to kiss you. And you can interpret the story that way if you feel like it. No harm if you want to do that. It's just that interpretation means that all the detail is lost. Why 12 and 13? Why why the frog? Why all the details of the story get lost, and the details are what count. Okay, that's it. We're now going to have a variation on the theme, and it's going to be read out to us by our favorite storyteller, Robin, from the Brothers Grimm, and the shoes that were danced to pieces. And of course, what I want you to do, you're going to have to come here. What I want you to do is every single detail in the story is there for a reason, and I want you to map the details in this story to the story of the Little Briar Rose, the story of Sleeping Beauty. So if I want you to sort of see where this it's going to be an almost completely different story, but I want you to still see or detect beneath it all the identical structure. life, death, back to life again. Okay, and perhaps possibly ending on a very pessimistic, rather different from the one of Little Brown Flowers.
So, good evening. The shoes that were danced to pieces. There was, once upon a time, a king who had 12 daughters, each one more beautiful than the other. They all slept together in one chamber, in which their beds stood side by side, and every night when they were in them, their king locked the door and bolted it. But in the morning, when he unlocked the door, he saw that their shoes were worn out with dancing. And no one could find out how that had come to pass. Then the king caused it to be proclaimed that whosoever could discover where they danced at night should choose one of them for his wife and be king after his death. But that whosoever came forward and had not discovered it within 3 days and nights should have forfeited his life. It was not long before a king's son presented himself and offered to undertake the enterprise. He was well received, and in the evening was led into a room adjoining the princess's sleeping chamber. His bed was placed there, and he was to observe where they went and danced. And in order that they might do nothing secretly or go away to some other place, the door of their room was left open. But the eyelids of the prince grew heavy as lead, and he fell asleep. And when he awoke in the morning, all 12 had been to the dance, for their shoes were standing there with holes in their soles. On the second and third nights, there was no difference. And then his head was struck off without mercy. Many others came after this and undertook the enterprise, but all forfeited their lives. Now, it came to pass that a poor soldier who had a wound and could serve no longer found himself on the road to the town where the king lived. There he met an old woman who asked him where he was going. "Well, I hardly know myself," answered he, and added in jest, "I had half a mind to discover where the princesses dance their shows into holes and thus become king." "Oh, that's not so difficult," said the old woman. "You must not drink the wine which we brought to you at night, and must pretend to be sound asleep." With that, she gave him a little cloak and said, "If you wear this, you will be invisible, and then you can steal after the 12. When the soldier had received this good advice, he fell to in earnest, took heart, went to the king, and announced himself as a suitor. He was as well received as the others, and royal garments were put upon him. He was conducted that evening at bedtime into the antechamber. And as he was about to go to bed, the eldest came and brought him a cup of wine. But he had tied a sponge under his chin and let the wine run down into it without drinking a drop. Then he lay down, and when he had lain a while, he began to snore as if in the deepest sleep. The 12 princesses heard that and laughed, and the eldest said, he too might as well have saved his life. With that, they got up, opened wardrobes, presses, cupboards, and brought out pretty dresses, dressed themselves before the mirrors, sprang about, and rejoiced at the prospect of the dance. Only the youngest said, I know not how it is. You are very happy, but I feel very strange. Some misfortune is certainly about to befall us. Oh, you are a goose. You're always frightened, said the eldest. Have you forgotten how many kings' sons have already come here in vain? I hardly had any need to give the soldier a sleeping draught. The booby would not have awakened anyway. When they were all ready, they looked carefully at the soldier, but he closed his eyes and did not move or stir, so they felt themselves safe enough. The eldest then went to her bed and tapped it, whereupon it immediately sank into the earth, and one after the other they descended through the opening, the eldest going first. The soldier, who had watched everything, tarried no longer, put on his little cloak, and went down last with the youngest. Halfway down the steps, he just trod a little on her dress. She was terrified at that and cried out, what is that? Who's pulling at my dress? Don't be so silly, said the eldest. You've caught it on a nail. Then they went all the way down, and when they were at the bottom, they were standing in a wonderfully pretty avenue of trees, all the leaves of which were silver and shone and glistened. The soldier thought, I must carry a token away with me, and broke off a twig from one of them, on which the tree cracked with a loud report. The youngest cried out again, oh, something is wrong. Did you hear the crack? The eldest said, it is a gun fired for joy, because we've got rid of our prince so quickly. And after that, they came into an avenue where all the leaves were of gold. And lastly, into a third, where they were of bright diamonds. He broke off a twig from each, which made such a crack each time that the youngest started back in terror, but the eldest still maintained that they were salutes. They went on, came to a great lake, whereon stood 12 little boats. And in every boat sat a handsome prince, all of whom were waiting for the 12, and each took one of them with him. But the soldier seated himself by the youngest. Then her prince said, I wonder why the boat is so much heavier today. I shall have to row with all my strength if I am to get it across. What should cause that? Said the youngest. But the warm weather. I feel very warm too. On the opposite side of the lake stood a splendid, brightly lit castle, from whence resounded the joyous music of trumpets and kettle drums. They rode there, entered, and each prince danced with the girl he loved. But the soldier danced with them unseen. And when one of them had a cup of wine in her hand, he drank it up, so that the cup was empty when she carried it to her mouth. The youngest was alarmed at this, but the eldest always silenced her. They danced there until 3 o'clock in the morning, when all the shoes were danced into holes and they were forced to leave off. The princes rowed them back again over the lake, and this time the soldier seated himself by the eldest. On the shore, they took leave of their princes and promised to return the following night. When they reached the stairs, the soldier ran on in front and lay down in his bed. And when the 12 had come up slowly and wearily, he was already snoring so loudly they could all hear him, and they said, "So far as he's concerned, we're safe." They took off their beautiful dresses, laid them away, put the worn-out shoes under the bed, and lay down. Next morning, the soldier was resolved not to speak, but to watch the wonderful goings on, and again went with them a second and a third night. Then everything was just as it had been the first time. And each time they danced until their shoes were worn to pieces. But the third time, he took a cup away with him as a token. When the hour had arrived for him to give his answer, he took the 3 twigs and the cup and went to the king. But the 12 stood behind the door and listened for what he was going to say. When the king put the question, "Where have my 12 daughters danced their shoes to pieces in the night?" he answered, "In an underground castle with 12 princes," and related how it had come to pass and brought out the tokens. The king then summoned his daughters and asked them if the soldier had told the truth. And when they saw that they were betrayed and that falsehood would be of no avail, they were obliged to confess all. Thereupon the king asked which of them he would have to wife. He answered, "I am no longer young, so give me the eldest." Then the wedding was celebrated on the selfsame day, and the kingdom was promised him after the king's death. But the princes were bewitched for as many days as they had danced nights with the 12. Thank you.
That was beautifully read. So, what should we do? Has anyone got any ideas? Why shoes with holes in the soles? Why 12 princesses? Why does the man who betrays the daughters, why is he wounded? What's this about it's being a good thing to drink wine in this world? Sorry, a bad thing to drink wine in this world, but a very good thing to drink wine in the world beyond. So many questions. And what Lévi-Strauss taught us is that every detail counts. Every little detail is there for a reason. These stories might look like absurdity piled upon absurdity, but there's method in the madness, if you like. There's a reason for everything. And if we don't understand the reason, if the story seems to us just a bit of nonsense, it's because we haven't understood the deep intelligence in these stories. They are there for a reason. These particular ones in Europe have been carried through time by we call them old wives' tales, don't we? The old wives have known how important they are. They had to survive the witch burnings, the Inquisition. They had to censor the stories in different ways, disguise them in order to get through the patriarchal censorship. And they're about what it means to be human in the deepest sense. They're part of initiation, actually. They're part of not just, they weren't just told among children, they'd have been told among adults as well, but they're critical to teaching the young, each new generation, and this is particularly clear among hunters and gatherers, like the meaning of life, teaching each new generation the rules that need to be observed. They might be bottom-up rules that nobody's sort of legislating the rules, but still, in all human cultures, there are things you shouldn't do as well as things that you should do. And above all, there's this wonderful principle. I'm an atheist, by the way, but there's this wonderful principle behind all the world's religions, which I think is so admirable and so different from what we have under capitalism. And that's the idea that not everything has a price. Some things are sacred. And in particular, the body is sacred. And it's marked sacred in different ways, but you'll find blood, red, is a way of marking particularly the female body as sacred. And there's an argument which I make in my book, and we go with in the radical anthropology group, that women probably in a world where, I mean, you can argue, I think, that women are not good at certain things, and they're not very good at violence compared with men. Men are better at violence, probably, on average. And so that means probably women need to be able to defend themselves by establishing our bodies are sacred. Probably that need is one maybe felt by women more than men in so many societies, not all, of course. Where shall we start? Shall I just ask one question? Last week we did Little Briar Rose. And do you remember the episode with the great, after the spell had been cast, so Beauty had pricked her finger, she bled. I asked you here what you might think that means, given that these stories are about what it means to be human. Why does a girl come of age, she's 15 in the story, and bleed? And pretty much all of you thought it was kind of a coded reference to the fact that girls do come of age and bleed. And it's called menstruation, which means moon change. But what happened, of course, in this story is that the blessing of menstruation was rejected by the king, turned into a curse, therefore, because patriarchy tends to have very, very big problems with menstruation, despite it being the signal of fertility. And therefore, the 13th fairy, the powerful one, decided to punish the king by making sure that a particularly long period of seclusion, 100 years, would be imposed, because the king tried to get rid of the seclusion altogether, tried to ignore the blessing of menstruation. And then what happened was the spell was cast, the spell of blood was cast right across the entire kingdom, and everything came still. All the normal activities in the castle stopped. Everyone froze in their place, and around the castle grew over the years a great hedge of thorns. Perhaps somebody remind me what happened when the young men decided that they'd heard of this beautiful, the most beautiful maiden in all the world, but it's asleep deep in the forest. And they get off there, they'd hear about this at some tavern on the edge of the forest, have a few drinks, decide, okay, I think I'm going to go see if I can get into the castle and conquer that maiden. What happens is they get off the horse and take out their sword and try to get through the great hedge of thorns in that story. They all get ensnared in the briars. Okay, so let's just I mean, we could start anywhere with the story. What's the sort of equivalent in this story to that episode? Every single prince who tries to get to the princesses without their permission, if you like, they have their heads chopped off. So that's sort of, I mean, it's different. Of course it's different. It's supposed to be different. But there's a kind of element there, isn't there, of women's defiance of men. And anyone, let me just say, I'm just ad-libbing here. I'm just improvising. Whatever comes to mind. I'm looking at your faces, really. So I might forget something. But remember that the critical thing is that every detail needs to be accounted for, and some are easier to explain than others. So don't let me forget anything. Just remind me if it's something which we don't seem to have covered. So, okay, well, shoes dance to pieces, holes in the soles. Any ideas?
Suggestions on Zoom.
Sorry?
Lots of suggestions in the chat.
Oh,
on
I'm not
Zoom.
reading the chat. I haven't got my glasses
Yeah,
on. I'll
just
check.
do it now.
Manchego's got his hand raised.
Where's the blood flow to get to the other world? And they've got all kinds of Zoom into the other world, yeah. And they've got all kinds of suggestions
Oh,
about the soldier's wound, the red wine, the shoes with the holes.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. It's very small print. You people on Zoom. I'm going to have to relate to the people I can see here mostly.
Oh, okay.
But Camilla can read
see,
things
it's
out.
okay, we can
It's
see.
it's good. Okay.
They're interested.
Right.
We've got
Right. Shoes. What's a shoe?
Well, Kraft Debbing said
Oh,
about
there's a voice
shoes.
coming from the box. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, Zoom is amplified to the room. Go on.
Go on then.
Kraft Debbing said about shoes that they were, like the opposite of the phallic symbol, or the symbol
All right.
for a vagina. And
Fair.
you get, if you get a pair of shoes that's got holes in it, it's going to cause bleeding.
Okay, so this is a very, very conventional idea in
That's true.
Manche, I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying a classic idea in, I don't know, Jung, Freud. I mean, everybody really is that you have sort of banana-shaped things, and you have shoe-shaped things, and so the shoe is kind of, well, it's already kind of a hole, I suppose, but this is a hole, holes in the soles, I don't know. It's an opening. It's as Manchego said, it's kind of the opposite of a penis, of a phallus. I mean, maybe enough
Well,
said.
back to the phallus theme, though. You know, these guys in this story, in the other story, they're getting caught up in the briars. And they're bleeding there and dying. In this story, they're getting their heads cut off. That is, total Freud, right there. That's a castration.
They're certainly getting their heads cut off. What other parts of their bodies have been cut off? I mean, obviously they can't use the other parts of their bodies if their head's gone. So it's a pretty
There's lots
serious.
of blood flow.
It's quite a lot of blood flow, and the blood flow probably goes through the hole. I mean, the hole in the soles. I mean, it's like flowing blood. And I mean, to be honest, all the world's magical myths and fairy tales are about a certain kind of magic, and it's got to do with, like, being alive, dying, come back to life again, the way the moon does, of course. I mentioned earlier, menstruation is moon change. It's the meaning of it. Many cultures have other slightly different words. I'm with the moon, I'm blessed by the moon, I've gone to the moon, I've been to the moon, whatever. So this idea of being alive and then dead and then coming back to life is clearly linked in the stories to the moon and therefore to menstruation, in which case menstruation is kind of death to this world, new life to the other world. But the strange and magical thing about this death is that it's temporary. When you menstruate, you die, but you come alive again. So you come alive, of course, to this world and to the relationships that you enjoy in this world. Of course, you enjoy very different relationships in the other world. So if you like, one side of you, one persona, the persona when you're in this world is a different persona, and it's almost as if you've killed one side of you for the other side of you, the other structures of relationship that you're involved in, to enter into a new life. Okay, let's just go to another really critical feature. What's the story's attitude to marriage? Is marriage a lovely event? Once you're married, are you free? Once you're married, is that cause for celebration? Do you all live happily ever after? From the girl's point of view, where is marriage? How is it coded? It's a punishment. You got caught out. Your fate will be to get married off to somebody.
We have nothing to worry about.
And that's right, exactly. We've nothing to worry about. Well, that's it. So, so clearly, the girls' freedom is to avoid their father knowing what they're up to when they're young. And perhaps just say another thing. I'm thinking of two things now. In this story, how do you get to the other world? I mean, I just want literally, I don't want philosophy. I don't need philosophy yet.
Bed.
Sorry?
Your big sister's bed.
With the bottom of your big sister's bed. The way to, if there's 12 of you, the way to get to the other world is to all jump into bed together and have a great time, which is kind of the opposite of marriage. Okay, but there's another question, of course, is that the king seems to have 12 daughters. So where are his sons? Bit odd to have 12 daughters and no sons at all, isn't it?
That's down to the king's dodgy sperm.
Getting their eggs cut off, isn't there? So-
Or yeah, but okay, but are the people who have their heads cut off their brothers?
No.
No, they're not. Are they? They're strangers. They're princes from other countries. So I'll just say this:
One's in the boats are the brothers.
the ones in the boats are their brothers. Well, okay, so let's just explore that. I mean, all kinds of suggestions come to mind. There don't seem to be any other characters who might qualify as brothers, but there are 12 of them, and the girls do seem to want to meet up with them, and they're not married yet, and so it's kind of getting sort of suggestive. And I just say this, that so many of the fairy tales, they end up with the prince and princess, the prince and his bride. They finally make it together. The prince wins his bride, they get married, and they all live happily ever after. But that's the culmination of a story, the middle of which is very different. The middle of which is an episode of, if you like, blood. And my book's actually called Blood Relations. So what Levi-Strauss says, you have two categories. You have kinship and affinity. That's technical terms. So you have either relations by blood or relationships between people of different blood, and we call that affinity or marriage, whereas kinship through blood is technically called consanguinity, the same blood. And what Levi-Strauss says is that if you can't find, well, he says he describes relationships between kin as a kind of polar extreme, the opposite extreme to relationships between non-kin. And you have excessive intimacy between kin as the heart of so many of the stories. So Beauty and the Beast, so many other stories. That the middle of the story, which is all about blood solidarity, is kind of intimacy between kin. Now, patriarchy tends to sort of demonize that kind of intimacy between the blood and call it incest. So it's kind of a way of demonizing a relationship between brothers and sisters as something like the most evil thing you can possibly have, which is relationships between people of the same blood. But still, despite that, as Levi-Strauss points out, the episode in which there's an intimacy with a monster, like the dragon who has custodianship of the maiden, maybe it's a many-headed dragon, but anyway, what Levi-Strauss says that look for the incest. I mean, I'm using the word incest because Levi-Strauss does, but don't think in social work terms, don't think of sexual abuse terms. It's an intimacy between those who share blood together. And Levi-Strauss says, if you can't see it, you're not looking properly. So maybe it's kind of the nearest we can get, isn't it? Where are the king's sons? In other words, where are the 12 sisters, brothers? Well, they do go down into the underworld and they have a great time. And it's not marriage. So it's like immature, playful, erotic relationship. It seems quite erotic. It seems very romantic. And so that explains why we don't see the brothers, because they're kind of in disguise, aren't they, in the other world? Why 3 days? Why 3 nights rather? They're not days, they're 3 nights. What is it about 3? What does the moon do for 3 nights each month?
Is that dark moon? It's the process of dark moon, or that there's this beginning of dark moon, and then right? Or 9, when the
that's it.
moon disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a convention, it's a bit, it depends quite where the horizon is, whether it's two nights or 4 nights or wherever, exactly where there's, how many trees there are on the horizon and stuff. But yes, conventionally, the moon disappears for 3 nights each month. And again, conventionally, those 3 nights of darkness are the kind of proper time for menstrual bleeding, in the sense that full moon is honeymoon, romance, the moon in June, boys and girls come out to play, the moon does shine as bright as day. The full moon is the time for romance, and the dark moon is the time for, in patriarchal terms, for witchcraft. So relationships which are witchy, but not heterosexually romantic, but perhaps romantic in their own way. But so now, okay, let's get to the sort of center of the whole story. What's going on? What do those girls, where do they go? What's happening? What kind of space are we in as the bed opens up? And what might that relate to? And again, we can relate that back to Little Briar Rose and the Sleeping Beauty that we looked at last week.
I guess
What's-
when the thing opens, the girls pass through from this world to the next world, or when they're having their menstruation in theory, but they're not visible to the king.
Yes, exactly. Did everyone hear that? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's fairly clear that this corresponds to the menstrual seclusion that's the centerpiece, the 100-year seclusion, of course, in the Sleeping Beauty. The girls are, when you see beautiful pictures, there's all kinds of lovely pictures of these events in the old 18th and 19th century fairy tale books. You see a line of trees, some with silver leaves, some with gold leaves, some with diamonds. You've got a starry night sky. You've got a slender new moon, crescent moon, just appearing in the sky, and it's clearly an underworld, pleasurable space to be in for these girls. So it's a version of seclusion, menstrual seclusion, very different from the usual patriarchal construct where a woman is put in a hut somewhere and all on her own and not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that. The nearest I've heard about in ethnography, hunter-gatherer ethnography, is a marvelous description in a book called The Forest People by Colin Turnbull, published a long time ago, 40, 50 years ago. He was working with the Mambuti people in the Ituri forest in Central Africa. And a whole chapter is devoted to what happens to a girl in this society. And I'm mentioning this because it seems to me to echo quite well with what we've been hearing about. In this society, when a girl first bleeds, and in the example he records, 2 girls menstruate at the same time. So 2 girls are blessed by the moon. And for the Mambuti people, this is the most joyful occasion. There's an occasion for massive joy, celebration, laughter. And what happens is they do go into seclusion, the 2 girls, but not on their own. They go into seclusion with their aunts and mothers and sisters, particularly their older female relatives. And they go into the biggest house they ever make. It's called the Elima hut, but it's a grass hut, but it's like a very big one, because it's got a whole 14, 15, 12 or so women, and they sing and they sing and they sing inside the house. And after a while, after a lot of singing's been going on, the boys begin to hear about this exciting news that there's 2 girls who come of age, and they begin to congregate around the outside of the house, hoping for some of the girls to make an appearance. When the girls do make an appearance, they've got these flexible sticks, like whips, and they rush out of the house and they chase the boys. The boys have to run away, and they do, kind of laughing. It's a playful fight with the girls very much on top. And any boy who gets touched by one of these saplings is on a bound to go into that Elima house. And I would describe that Elima house as as a model, really, of the world's first church, the world's first synagogue, the world's first mosque or temple. They don't have men's houses. They don't have patriarchal gods and all that stuff. They have this Elima house. And inside, of course, there's lots of blood. Well, most of the world's religions, I was brought up a Catholic. You go to church and there's quite a lot of blood involved. It's the blood of Jesus, it's the wine, but in all these religions, you'll find blood. pretty central. But here it's menstrual blood, and it's a joyful, pleasurable occasion. The girls absolutely love it, and they have this playful sex with the boys who they chase. And a boy who's on a bound to enter that house, he's given a good old drubbing by the women inside. And he didn't go into too much detail what happens inside, but it seems pretty likely that a young boy has a kind of sexual initiation being jumped on by 10 or 12 girls. And so it's a very different idea from the sort of machismo idea of conquering a girl as your first, sexual experience. It's the other way around in that society. Now, of course, there are all kinds of different societies. Not all hunter-gatherers do that, but I have a feeling that something like that is very ancient. So there's this idea of menstruation being a cause of celebration. The blood is synchronized. The experience of seclusion is collectivized, and it's a source of joy and laughter, as in this story. And we talked about the role of marriage here. The girls are betrayed, and you could, I think, see the traitor as the old lady who gave the secrets away to the wounded soldier. Why is the soldier wounded? We mentioned that he is wounded. What advantage does being wounded give you? It's already a premonition, isn't it, of this thing that happens in the patriarchal religions, where the source of the sacred blood becomes increasingly that of a man. So I was brought up a Catholic. I'm an atheist, of course. I'm a scientist. I think you have to be an atheist. Doesn't mean you don't believe in magic. I very much believe in magic. There's lots of magic in life.
The old lady is actually the 30th fairy.
Yes, the old lady is a traitor.
She's the 13th fairy.
And I think she's the 13th fairy, and she's doing kind of the opposite of what we have in the Sleeping Beauty. In the Sleeping Beauty, the 13th fairy is the one who stands by her values, her principles at all costs, and she ends up victorious. Here we have the 13th producing a very different outcome. And I mentioned earlier, there's nothing to stop these stories being used in all sorts of different ways for political purposes. And it's actually for that reason that Levi-Strauss says, let's forget about morals in this story. Let's forget about what these stories kind of mean in moral terms when somebody hears the story. What's the message? Because Levi-Strauss says, well, it's kind of whatever you think the message is. So under different political, gender circumstances, people will derive different messages from the stories. So that's why Levi-Strauss insists on looking at the structure, the grammar of the stories. That's the part which is the deepest part. And that's the part which can't be changed. So in the story of the Sleeping Beauty, it's a story of the triumph of the 13th fairy over the king. It's like, okay, he's a powerful man, he's a king, he's clearly some kind of Christian, sun worshipper, but even he can't stop that natural thing happening. A girl coming of age, her very nature will mean that she'll bleed. And the 13th fairy kind of represents that power. And as far as we can see from that story, she triumphs. She taught the world a lesson. And as I said last week, I can, when I hear that story, I can still hear that 13th fairy, that matriarch, saying, "You men, you think you can control time with your artificial man-made solar months. We'll teach you a thing or two about time, we women, and we'll lock you in time for as long as we feel like."
So what's going on with the old woman in this story then?
Well, I mean, she gives the wounded soldier, now a soldier who's bled is already halfway there into the other world. He's already he's doing something which women do, namely he's bled, he was wounded, but he's still alive. It's a little bit like when a woman menstruates, she bleeds, kind of dies, but you're still alive. So he's already halfway there. But what she does, what the old lady does, the old, I suppose the 13th heroine of the story, the 13th of the, I mean, there's 12 girls.
12 girls, 12 boys.
And there's 12 boys.
And the
So there's,
woman.
thank you, Camilla.
So it's
So there's
13.
12 girls, 12 boys, and in each case there's a 13th. And the 13th woman is the one who gives the secrets away. She gives away the secret. You wait till the girls give you a drink of red wine. Make sure you put a sponge under your chin. So she's warning him, and he takes advantage of that. And then he goes incognito with the invisible cloak into the underworld. And he's the one who proves that this is going on. This is why the king's
Well, I
daughters.
can see that, but why is it so different from the Sleeping Beauty version, where the 13th fairy is an absolute sort of like feminist
Yeah,
heroine?
but I mean, when you say why is it so different? As I said at the very beginning this evening, the whole point is that these stories can be used for all kinds of different purposes. And as I said about the Sleeping Beauty, you can read it. And Andrea Dworkin in Woman Hating, I remember reading her book in the was it 1970, something like that. I thought, okay, so all these fairy tales should be destroyed with a blowgun, with a flamethrower, because they're all patriarchy, which is sort of true. They are all patriarchy in the sense that something's happened to the stories to make them fit into patriarchy. I think patriarchy I would have thought would have quite a lot of trouble with quite a few of the stories, the Sleeping Beauty in particular. But I mean, it's quite clear to me that in terms of the message of the stories, this one is the exact opposite of the previous one. Tonight's story is the opposite of last week's. Last week's being in the other world for 100 years was a punishment meted out by the 13th fairy. Here, the girl's punishment is to be married.
I wonder, do we think that there's any link between Rosie mentioned in the chat that the queen, the girl's mother, isn't mentioned at all anywhere. Do we think she might be the old woman just in disguise, and she's the one who's bringing their sort of partying to an end and making them grow up?
I mean, personally, I would need convincing. I don't think, I mean, the queen is, I would agree with you. It's a very important observation. The queen is pretty non-existent. She's pretty inactive. I think the old woman who gives away the secrets and confers the cloak to make you invisible, I think she's much older than the queen. I think she's a really old lady. So yeah.
Could I put in a point about time? Don't go away, Chris. I'm just
sorry.
saying. I didn't want to make you go away.
Okay.
Both the stories. So in Sleeping Beauty, because the king denies the daughter's fertility and menstrual cycle, there's this exaggerated being stuck in time for 100 years before the final happy ever after. But in this story, we have the girls refusing marriage, keeping on dancing, keeping the shoes being danced to pieces, going to their kinsmen. And so we get another form of being stuck in the other world.
Yeah.
They're both of them talking about getting stuck in one phase of time. And both of them are trying to sort of restore a certain balance of time. The little phrase right at the end about the princes being stuck for as many nights, as many days, thank you, as the nights that they had danced. So there's an insistence that there should be a balance between like the dark nights and the light days in both stories.
Yeah.
So you could see the old woman's role as like the 13th fairy is trying to bring back from being stuck in one phase to a kind of balance.
Yeah. Let me just.
But I want to say something. Can I say something about this balance?
Yeah, Dickie, of course you can. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that it's the opposite way in the two stories, but in the second one it can seem logical that it's forced upon them, but it's like the phase that already patriarchy took place in a very deep way that even the woman sold them out. In the old woman who told the soldier.
Yeah.
And in both stories, you can see in the first one, the king is the one who is conflicting with nature, conflicting with the moon.
Yeah.
And the reality is that there is 13, and not only he's fighting against fertility, he cannot make his wife pregnant at the beginning.
Exactly, yeah.
It's something really deep in his he wants to control everything. And
That's
then
right.
the fairy puts him in his place. Okay, you will have to wait and it will happen. if you want it or not. In the other story, I think the king is a little bit triumph. Okay, the king is fighting nature. He even makes 12 girls and 12 boys. That means he stopped in the 12 number. This is, I keep asking myself, why only 12? Where's the 13th? Maybe the wounded soldier is one of the boys who lost in the.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he, in this phase, he's fighting, but it's like in a deeper phase of patriarchy. This is how I feel. And this is the phase when even mothers are a little bit already bought into the idea that girls need to be controlled and married and stop playing.
But are you saying that the Sleeping Beauty is a sort of earlier phase of patriarchy? Because I think the opposite. I think the Sleeping Beauty is definitely making the king look ridiculous, trying to control time, having these ridiculous man-made months.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe in the beginning they could be, the stories could be more explicit.
Yeah.
And could be when people still remembered that there is a 13th fairy.
Yeah.
And the king was funny. I don't have a plate for her. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Then I want to just, there's one more thing we haven't discussed, one more detail. And it's quite a complex one, actually. It's the tokens. So when the wounded soldier with his invisible cloak goes down into the underworld, yeah, there's 3 nights. And in each night, actually, each of the 3, there are 3 tokens which he steals. So he steals a branch of silver, a branch of gold, and a branch of diamonds. And each time he breaks off the branch, what happens?
There's a loud crack.
A loud sound, which the older daughter, the older sister, describes as, "Oh, don't be frightened. It's a gun salute." And those are the cannon that fire, cannonball, making a huge commotion each time the branches break. So clearly there's a very loud noise which could be mistaken for cannon shot or gunshot, a gun salute. So at the beginning of Claude Lévi-Strauss's mythology, the volume called The Raw and the Cooked, quite near the beginning, I think it might be chapter 2 or 3, or perhaps even chapter 1, there's a whole discussion of noise. And actually the theme of noise and silence occurs right through all the volumes, in fact. But Lévi-Strauss, to begin with, he talks about there's particularly loud noises in Europe. We don't do it so much these days, actually, but we used to make, and we still do it, we still have fireworks at New Year. But I remember as a boy, I lived with my granny up in Kingsbury, North London. It's quite away from the Thames. But I remember at midnight on New Year's Eve, all the ships up and down the Thames making this huge noise. And but anyway, Lévi-Strauss goes about Chinese New Year and all the other New Years, the split in time between the 2 years, sort of hole in time, is marked by noise. But he also points out that when in Europe in the Middle Ages, actually until reasonably recently, he says, what happens when a community, and we might think of this as perhaps a rather reactionary community, but probably they had a point, when they decide that the very old man is getting married to a very young woman, or something inappropriate about their relationship, maybe they're cousins or something. And what happens is the charivari. In other words, when the couple are at night are supposed to be enjoying their honeymoon, what you do is you get under their bedroom with all your pots and pans and make as loud a noise as you possibly can to break up the lovemaking, to break up the romance. And I actually, I mean, another thing I remember is just, does it happen today? I suppose it probably does a little bit. When a couple go off on their honeymoon, everyone sort of wants to make fun of them, if they do want to make fun of them, and you tie all these tin cans behind the car and you go dang, 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 the noise. So there's an element of noise being antithetical to lovemaking, but the noise is in the dark time of the month or the dark time of the year is the antithetical to a full moon. So full moon should be gentle sounds, maybe gentle music, but dark moon is the kind of noise which makes it impossible to relax, and it would completely ruin your honeymoon. But he also has a very big theme in the book, in the volume called The Raw and the Cooked, about how noise stops cooking from happening. So if you've got a big earth oven and you've got a large animal which you need to roast, silence, 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 don't make a noise. Anyone makes a noise, the blood's going to start seeping up in the meat and it's not going to cook properly. And then of course you have the idea of the raw and the cooked. So a woman who's menstruating, she's raw and therefore unavailable for consumption, if you like, for a relationship. When she's cooked, you could have sex with her. So the raw and the cooked have a map onto in mythology to sexually available and unavailable. Anyway, in this story, we have these loud noises made as the wounded soldier breaks off the trophies to prove that he's where he's been to the king. You know, where are we getting to now with all this? Okay,
It's the stealing.
right now across the world are what are called myths of matriarchy, myths of primitive matriarchy. So and when I say across the world, I really mean across the world, but maybe we've forgotten some of them over here. But wherever you have in the world a male monopoly of ritual power, so very large parts of Papua New Guinea, Amazonia, parts of Africa, you have a thing called a men's house. And the first temples and churches are these things called men's houses. And where men exercise this monopoly of ritual power, they have a myth to explain how they acquired that power. And the story is, you're doing a chat. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, so I'll just do a really simple version of a matriarchy myth. Once upon a time, women ruled the world. Men had to do all the work. Men had to suckle the babies at their breasts. And you know, the women just sat at home, having a great time, doing whatever they please, and just taking away the products of men's labor. If they were hunting, the poor men would have to keep on surrendering their meat to the women, and so the poor men were being oppressed by the women. And one day, a hero sorted the women out. And what happened is he heard the women how they perform their tricks. So when the women burst out of the women's house, looking like gods, savages with wearing masks, beating the ground with big thick carpets as the whole earth shakes, pretending to be spirits, a male hero worked it all out. No, it's all a fake. Those women aren't spirits at all. They just put on face paint. They come out with these big, you know, fur skin rugs and beat them on the floor. Maybe they got drums, maybe they got bull roarers, maybe they got magic flutes. But anyway, these flutes, often called, as Levi-Strauss explained, instruments of darkness, the kinds of noise you make around dark moon, these are the source of women's power. So what do men do? A very brave man in the Baruya version is so brave, he went into a woman's menstrual hut. Now that is really brave, because you go into a woman's menstrual hut, your penis will wither away, you'll die very quickly. It's a terribly potent substance, all this blood all over the bloody place. But he was such a brave man that he went in there and stole from under the skirt of his sister the bull roarers or the magic flute, and brought them back to this world, brought them back from the other world, which is the women's world, where they bleed, into this world in triumph. And ever since, men have had the power. Okay. A familiar fairy story in this part of the world is Jack and the Beanstalk. So what does Jack do? He goes up 3 times, remember the 3, up into the sky, climbs up the beanstalk. He has to be hidden by the giant's wife in a kind of womb. It's a sauce, it's a big oven, or it's a big pot, or it's a big, and while he's in there, the giant says as follows: fee, fi, fo, bum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. He's a cannibal, a monster. But what Jack does, he goes 3 times into the sky, into this womb-like containers, where he's almost eaten alive by the giant, who's a very, very sort of sexually ambivalent giant. He's got a huge mouth, and you don't quite know what gender he is, but most people think he's a male of some sort. And he comes back with, what is it? The goose that lays the golden egg, the heart that plays by itself, and a big sack of gold. And he comes back down to this earth, chops down the beanstalk. There's no more movement up and down between this world and the other, because the beanstalk's been chopped down. And ever since then, you know, life's been safe for I suppose, for marriage, the family, and patriarchy. So in this story, we have the same motif of going into the other world, into the world of the sisters, which I would interpret as the world of women's seclusion, and stealing their treasures, the three treasures, the branches of silver, of gold, and diamonds, and taking them back to this world. And then he uses those.
And a cup.
And well done, and the cup, and we mustn't forget the cup as well. but I mean, we sort of maybe haven't finished with the cup. So and that's the reason why that kind of brings about this punishment that the girls have to put up with, which is of course getting married. And then of course we have the cup.
The Grail. Manchego is suggesting
Well, the Holy Grail,
echoes of the Grail.
the Holy Grail is of course a
Holy
cup
Grail.
with blood in it. It's certainly a
and
cup
the
which is
future king is the guardian who's the wounded.
yes, of course.
And
Yeah,
so
I mean, we can go through all the world's myths and keep on finding connections.
it's
not,
questionable who the soldier is. The soldier kin to them, because it's a very strange ending. We've got one man marries the eldest,
yeah.
but all the others are still unmarried. So
Yes. I mean,
it doesn't say.
there's a bit
The
of a
other
puzzle there. Yeah.
princes are stuck in.
But what's into
But now the eldest is married off, then the others can be married off.
yeah, they're available to be wedded, and that is certainly their fate. They're all going to get married off. You don't really have much doubt about that when you hear the story. But what's interesting as well is
He
this
sits
idea.
next to the youngest, and he sits next to the eldest. Who
Yes,
is he?
yes.
He's a
Well-
lunar symbol of some sort.
Well, he's some kind of trickster. I would agree. You can't be a wounded man without being
He's
some kind of
wounded,
trickster.
Gender ambiguous.
He's gender ambiguous because of his wound. But also, I just wanted to remind everyone that it's a very bad thing to be drinking wine from this cup in this world. That's going to put you to sleep. That's the menstrual curse. That's something given to you by these women who are just about to go into the other world. Be very careful. And yet, when you're in the other world, what does he do? He goes around stealing other people's wine and drinking as he pleases. And the girls think, where did my wine, my goblet go? It's, because he's stolen it. So again, what you do in this world is kind of the opposite of what you do in the other world. And that made very, very clear, as Camilla said, by the very ending, which is this symmetry. And the story ended it does. But the princes were bewitched for as many days as they had danced nights with the 12. So when they were down in the underworld, they were sort of blessed with this joyful dance. But once they're up in this world, that blessing becomes a curse, a bewitchment for the same amount of time. So there's this alternation between this world and the other world. And there's a kind of, yes, I think there's a sort of propaganda attempt to justify all that's going on by sort of saying we need some sort of balance. Because patriarchy always accuses women when they want a little bit of power of going to the other extreme and wanting to completely subordinate, cruelly exploit, trick, harass men. And so when men do precisely that, actually, when men take over, of course, in these cultures where you have a men's house, the men really, they don't take the power and surrender it, in a playful, laughing, joyful way. When men take the power, they sure as hell hang on to it. But they justify their hanging on to power by saying, well, that's what women used to do to us, which is obviously a bit of propaganda, because that story I mentioned to you earlier from the forest people about the Alima house, what happens is the girls do have a lot of power during their Alima ceremony, but they're very happy to surrender it, let go, and have a kind of alternation. And in other hunter-gatherer cultures, which make that idea of a playful alternation between power even more explicit.
Can I ask you something about the king?
Yeah.
You said that these myths are actually very, very old, like much, like definitely pre-patriarchal.
Well, you can't quite say how old a version is. It's just that the grammar is truly ancient, and it takes us back to the sort of big bang of culture. I mean, if you think of the emergence of language, culture, religion, symbolism as a kind of, as a leap. I mean, clearly it took a long time. Clearly it was an evolutionary process, but it culminated in revolution. The underlying syntax of world mythology is as old as that. It takes us back to the moment when religion, culture, language, you know, the moment when we became a symbolic species. And I'm using the word moment.
So do they predate patriarchy?
Yeah. Yeah, but June, I'm trying to say, you can't say a myth is this old or that old. A myth can't exactly be ancient if by a myth you mean one of its versions. I mean, these versions, I mean, the Grimm's versions come from what, 17th, 18th century. So, and they might have a miller, a farmer,
And
various.
there's been an attempt to date stories like Jack and the Beanstalk by using like linguistic trees so that it supposedly has roots in Proto-Indo-European, which would suggest it's very much, these stories are talking about a time frame of transition from something non-patriarchal to something.
I mean, just to point, when I did my PhD here at UCL, it was a reanalysis of Claude Lévi-Strauss's mythologique. And one of the things which struck me is more and more observed the more I found out about it. And this is relating to the question of the age of the myths. What Lévi-Strauss was arguing in mythologique, right up until he died, he kept the same position. He said, these myths are about the origins of culture. So they're about how animals eat their meat raw, humans invented the idea of cooking. And then animals go around naked, humans invented clothing. You know, and then, I don't know, from honey to ashes, the naked man, all these different stories. And what he thought was that these stories go back to the time when human symbolic culture emerged. They're about the emergence of symbolic culture. And what I'm saying here is that actually they're not at all. They're about the origins of what men regard as culture. So they're actually about the origins of patriarchy. But the structure of the stories is very much older than the emergence of patriarchy. So the stories emerge from the period before. It's hard to know what words to use, matriarchy and all these, and then none of the words are very satisfactory. And my own view, there was never exactly a matriarchal society in the sense of a society like the reverse of patriarchy. Women, in my view, have never wanted to stomp around dominating men. It's not the way women would want to do things. Women, when they've got some power, they're much more playful. But still, according to Lévi-Strauss, these stories are about how cooking was invented by men, how the incest taboo was invented by men, how wearing clothes was invented by men. And at each stage, these inventions were at the expense of monsters of various sorts. Maybe they're crocodiles, maybe they're, you know, but anyway, nature. And as soon as you look at their version of nature, you can see that what they're really talking about is women who had to be conquered. And even the idea of menstrual synchrony is, you know, pretty much the whole of the origin of table manners is about men's fear of what would happen if women started messing up the cycles of the moon, the sun, the seasons by menstruating out of time. So he argues that the women had to be subjected to the rules, and women had to be taught by men, you should menstruate at this point in the moon. When you're pregnant, you should be pregnant for 9 months, not 10 months or 8 months, and all those things. So Lévi-Strauss takes at face value the moral message of these stories, imagining them to be about the origin of civilization, when it's perfectly clear that what the stories are about is about a change, sure enough. But the change was to sort of take hold of what women are, men as well, of course, and nobody should think that the whole of culture was just like a female invention. It obviously takes both sexes, but females would certainly have taken a decisive role in establishing certain things such as rules about who can have sex with whom. Women would suffer far more from violations of those rules. But anyway, so I'm just saying, this idea of how old the stories are, Lévi-Strauss sort of thought of them as old as culture itself, but he thought of symbolic culture itself as entirely invented by men.
Could you say that over time, these stories have invented their own teeth and claws, you know, as a meme, as a kind of Dawkins meme, that these stories have protected themselves against decoding too much? So yes, it takes on a patriarchal guise, but if you look behind it, you know, there is actually a straight, it's like breadcrumbs, isn't it? It's following the breadcrumbs back. You know, the more patriarchal they are, the more we can decode it back to a matriarchal source.
Yeah, Yeah,
So
I
that
agree
the
with that.
stories grow teeth, like, you know, Darwin's teeth and claws, they grow their own protection and they change over time to protect the ultimate
Yes.
knowledge.
I think that's a very good analogy. They need to defend themselves. The stories have got a sort of agency in the sense that you can't say this story was invented by this person and this by another person. Clearly, they're a collective voice. One of the ways to think of them, of course, is to think of dreaming. So we all have dreams, and the dreams, the reason we dream is we sort of got all kinds of contradictions and conflicts of the previous days or even years of experiences. They've got to be sort of sorted out. Some problems are just insoluble. You can't really do much about them, but you've got to sort of live with them. And your dreams are sort of making this effort to solve these contradictions. Well, when you're all very relaxed around a campfire, maybe, you know, I mean, really, you know, it's that between time just after the sun's gone down, but before it's fully dark. That's the time when people would have liked to share their dreams. And a myth is a shared dream. It's a dream that's become shared around and become collectivized. No one's really in control of your dreams, and I don't think anyone's in control of the myths either. And therefore, I think you're right that if there's any agency involved, it's almost as if the dream itself, when it becomes collective, is making its own sort of almost decisions. It's got to keep alive. Simply the sense that if it's dead, it's dead. It's got to keep alive. It's a bit like, as you say, like Dawkins' idea of selfish genes. The gene's got to replicate itself, and a meme's got to replicate itself. So that's a nice metaphor. Yeah. Hello. Yes.
So that's the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
One of the main things I'm hearing in the story is about that happens to be this particular thing. He doesn't understand something.
Yeah.
Something he doesn't understand, and then he's trying to understand it. Something that he doesn't understand. And then the story is part of its search to understand something.
Well, he doesn't understand what his daughters are doing, what they're up to, and there's a sort of kind of primordial, prototypical male ignorance, I suppose you could say, because of course women probably wanted to keep their secrets in real life, and he's a king, and of course patriarchy to a large extent would involve invading, exposing women's secrets and learning how to sort of deal with them, and to the extent that those secrets are sources of women's intimacy and solidarity and power. So you're right, there's ignorance there, which is not too different from the kind of ignorance that the king shows in the Sleeping Beauty, where, you know, where he doesn't seem to understand the meaning of menstruation, doesn't seem to understand. He thinks that a king can just legislate against coming of age and bleeding, and seems to have a big problem with fertility and the moon and all those things. So there's ignorance in both cases, and it's a kind of misunderstanding, which is, I suppose, typical of patriarchy, especially when it's, you know, sort of particularly wooden or extreme form of patriarchy. Yeah. Sorry.
Can I just interject? We haven't said anything about the story that this one most clearly links to.
Yeah.
In comparison,
Yeah.
which can people, we've got shoes, we've got fabulous dresses,
Oh,
we've
yeah.
got silver, gold, diamonds,
Yeah.
dark nights, dancing in splendid castles.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what is the links here? What are the connections and differences or similarities with Cinderella?
Oh,
We
yes.
should say something. Helen's got it.
Where's Helen?
Helen's on Zing.
Okay, Helen, are you going to?
Cinderella.
I mean, Cinderella is the most widely replicated story of all. I mean, there's a book called, what is it, 352 variants of Cinderella, which I found in the British Museum. But yes, so I mean, do we want to go into Cinderella? I mean, Camilla's absolutely right. It is probably the closest of all the best known fairy tales to this one.
Can you pad down what are I mean, there's in
Okay.
Cinderella you've
Yeah,
got a woman
Okay.
all by herself with this prince, and then you've got these 12 princesses and their shoes with holes in, with all their kinsmen. We call them brothers or kinsmen. What are the, I don't know, it's a bit late to
Well,
start on it,
it's
but
a bit late to
gotta
start.
be-
I mean,
there's got to be some
I mean, okay. I mean, I'll just say, this evening class is London, as far as we know, it should be in the Guinness Book of Records. It's been going on since 1978 or something. And after it had been going for about 5 or 6 years, I was teaching about mythology. I was very excited about Lévi-Strauss's mythologique. And then I began to get into fairy tales, and I immediately found, oh my God, it's a fantastic Little Briar Rose, Sleeping Beauty. It works beautifully. You know, you've got 13 wise women, 13 silver plates, 12 gold, all that stuff. Anyway, and I said, I remember saying, I know this theory doesn't work very well with other fairy tales. And I had to admit, I remember saying this, it was quite embarrassing. I said, I don't like Cinderella. No, I don't like that. There's something wrong with Cinderella. There's no blood in it. And then at the back of the class, there was Max Pearson, a wonderful, wonderful genius friend who died many years ago of a brain tumor, very terrible, for me, terrible loss of such a marvelous thinker. So he said, Chris, for God's sake, just Cinderella. You've got a girl who's been nicely cooked. That's why she's called Cinderella. She lives in the fireplace. She's covered in cinders. She's a nice cooked girl, and she's all on her own. Every man's dream woman. She's on her own. She hasn't got a mother, no sisters, blah, 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 and she's nicely cooked. And then,
ugly sisters,
and now you've got
yes.
these ugly sisters. Now, Max pointed this out to me, and I read the version. And I thought, of course, Max, you're so right. They can't be that ugly because the prince thinks they're beautiful. He mistakes them for the girl he's fallen in love with that left a shoe on the steps. So they can't really be ugly. But what we do know is that they bleed.
Hmm.
Why do they bleed?
They
Because
cut
their
their toes off to
their
fit in
wretched
the
mother
shoe.
wants them to. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Because their mother decided that they've got to get their slightly bigger feet than Cinderella's feet into the shoes which don't fit. So the prince has got his shoe. There's maybe one version, of course, it's the glass slipper. In other words, it's a furry slipper. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But to get the foot into the shoe, what does the mother do? Does everyone know? What do you do?
Cut a finger,
You get a very sharp knife.
and you cut a finger.
Well, in this case, they cut off her heel.
Yeah.
And then with the other sister, you cut off her toes. So you cut off her foot, and then she has to stick her foot, a bleeding foot, into the shoe. Now think of a bleeding foot into a shoe, or a foot into a shoe that's full of blood. I mean, again, the symbolism is pretty obvious and Freudian. But anyway, the prince, very happy to take away the sister, thinks she's gorgeous, but she passes as he's taking her away back to his palace to marry her. They pass a tree growing on the grave of Cinderella's mother. And in the tree, little tree, is a bird singing. What is it? How did she sing? Turn and peep, turn and peep. The true the false bride rides with you.
She's talking to the prince.
So the
Prince
exactly.
has
So
taken one of the
so-
other sisters.
So the prince is with one of the so-called ugly sisters. He doesn't realize she's ugly until the bird says, look into the shoe, whereupon he notices that she's bleeding. So it's only then when he puts her back again, doesn't want her, goes with the next sister who's also bleeding. And the bird says, look in the shoe, turn and peep.
Turn and peep, turn and peep.
Mm.
There's blood is in the
There's
shoe.
blood in the shoe.
false blood
The false
rides
bride
with you.
dies with you. That's right. So it's only when he has a girl who's not bleeding that he thinks she's the beautiful one. So it's clearly, and of course, the critical thing about the other two sisters is that they're kin. There's two of them, and they've got their mother. And a man doesn't want doesn't want his bride to be linked too closely with other women. He wants to be nice and cooked and isolated. And a woman whose mother's died is like, perfect. So it's an extremely patriarchal story, of course. But then, of course, remember what happens at the ball. So she goes these 3 nights to the ball. She wears a dress of rather like this story with the silver, the gold, and the diamonds. She goes first of all with a dress of silver, then of gold, then of diamonds. And the last part of the story is how she's been pursued by her father, and she goes into a little hut, which is clearly a sort of menstrual hut. The father takes a big axe and chops her out of it. I mean, anyone is very interested in my PhD thesis. Over there is the chapters in my PhD thesis, little pamphlet Rag brought out many years ago, all about Cinderella. And I linked Cinderella to other, not just to some Native American stories as well. It wasn't quite the topic for this evening, but I mean, of course,
Well, no,
the whole point is, yes, of course, I mean, the whole point is to say that these stories shed light on each other. The more of them you look at, the more of them I mean, let me say the critical point was this: give them respect. These stories are crystallized intelligence. They're not nonsense. You know, give them respect. Every detail's there for a reason. And then what you do is you move from one to the other to the other. And the more of them you respect and appreciate, the more they amplify each other. And eventually just you're kind of hearing, in some sense, the whole of human history as taught by these myths. This is the critical moment in history when we switch from a gender egalitarian society to an increasingly patriarchal one, is documented in these stories. So, I mean, is that enough? It's now 8 o'clock. Is that? Do we want any more on this? I think.
Any more questions in the audience?
So,
Any-
yeah, I'm being
yeah.
accused of wanting to go to the pub, which is some truth in that.
Any
actually,
more
yeah.
questions on Zoom here?
I'd love to ask about the silver, then the gold, then the diamond. What's that
Yeah.
about?
Well,
Is it just
I mean,
all celestial?
Sun, moon and stars, I'd say, obviously.
Yeah,
The stars are the dark moon is the Milky Way.
Yeah.
Something like that.
It's all
So sun-
celestial. Yeah, I get
sun,
it.
moon, and stars, but in some, as in the Sleeping Beauty, the sun and the moon are used as images of matriarchy versus patriarchy, which is certain logic to it. In this story, I don't think that's happening, but you still got the sun, the moon, and the stars. And the critical thing, of course, well, I mean, all sorts of critical things, but you can't really see the stars when the sun's shining, and you can't really see the stars when the moon's shining too bright. So if you can see all the stars, including the Milky Way, you can be pretty sure it's dark moon. It's that time of the month. That's where the stars are seen brightest. In this particular story, I don't think that point's made particularly powerfully, but I'm just trying to think about that. I mean, in the beautiful illustrations of the shoes that were danced to pieces, you see it's like an underworld palace with all these beautiful colonnades and stairways and spiral steps and stuff, and the sky. It actually reminds me of the Native American sweat lodge. In North America, you went into a sweat lodge, sometimes quite a big lodge, and in some of those sweat lodges, they had a hole in the roof, so that you could actually, you can't keep the steam in without closing that hole, but also for certain parts of the ceremony, you can open the hole, and the things I've read about it, these sweat lodges were in part astronomical observatories. So you actually look through holes put at different points in the roof in order to see
Shaking tents.
the shaking tents is another lovely word for them. So you have a sort of shaking, shimmering communion with each other and also the cosmos. So, but to see the stars, it has to be
So it's
dark
bringing
moon,
it's bringing
and it's
the
at dark
above,
moon.
yeah, down
Sorry?
to earth. Bringing the above down to earth somehow, somehow connecting.
Well, that's right. I mean, okay, that's another way of putting it. So heaven comes down to earth. I mean, everybody in all of the world's cultures, if you can't see the moon in the sky, there's an explanation. It's because the moon has come down to earth. How do you know it's come down to earth? Because women are menstruating. That's the moon inside you. The moon is like a trickster who's come down to earth, and the signal that is inside you is your blood.
Wow.
So what happens is that heaven and earth come together in these moments. So you're sort of in heaven. And I think in this story, those girls feel, yeah, we're in the underworld, but it's as near to heaven as you're going to get. And those anthropologists and their friends that they made in the rainforest, they would definitely say that, yeah, it is about as near to heaven as you can get when you're blessed by the moon in that way, and you're singing joyfully with each other. It's about as close as you can get.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you so much. That was really brilliant.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you.
So, okay.
Well, don't worry.
No, I'm not going to.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
never.
And people in the chat were asking about seeing the recording, and maybe some people here, so we will post. Lawrence has recorded it, So we'll post that when that's ready on Vimeo. So if people want to listen to it again, you've got it. And just to say to everyone on Zoom, thank you so much for coming several times, many of you. And we're closing down for Christmas, but we'll be back in January, January the 10th. So it's like 4 weeks. And the program will go up on Eventbrite for you very shortly. Some of it's already gone up on Facebook and the website already. So I hope everybody has a lovely holiday. We'll see you again next year, also next moon. So
Thank you.
bye then.
Bye, thank you.
Happy Christmas.
And I'm going to say goodbye
Thank
to
you.
everybody.
Just for you.
Thanks. See you. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Happy Christmas.
Bye.
Happy Christmas.
I
Happy
don't know.
Christmas.
Somebody may want to drink. I'm going to go to the cover shop.
Merry Christmas.